In June 2020, with every Gap store where you spent your Saturdays ordered closed, Simon Property Group filed suit against Gap. The company claimed $65.9 million. Not for broken infrastructure, not for stolen inventory, for 3 months of rent on stores that had been legally ordered to shut their doors. The specific lease language that made the case viable was not in the fine print. It was the primary instrument, a clause that required the retailer to pay a percentage of its gross sales above a fixed threshold, paid directly to the mall owner, every year, every quarter, every holiday season, in good years and bad, and in years when the government told you to lock the doors. If you shopped at Gap, if you bought a ring at Kay Jewelers, if you laced up at a Foot Locker in a mall that is now half empty, you were in a building running on this clause. Here is what it was, who put it there, and why the stores you watched close were paying for it long before Amazon arrived. The American mall wasn't built on a floor plan. It was built on a deal. A developer needed a name. Sears, JCPenney, Macy's. These were the stores that made a mall project financeable. A bank in the 1960s or the 1970s typically wanted a signed anchor commitment before releasing construction funds for a regional enclosed mall. Without that name on the paperwork, you usually weren't getting the loan. The anchor understood this from the beginning. It knew what its signature was worth at the negotiating table, and it charged for it. What the anchor charged for wasn't just favorable rent terms. The anchor got below market rent, sometimes well below market, in exchange for agreeing to anchor the building. The developer accepted that arrangement because the anchor's presence made everything else possible. If Sears signed, the bank funded. If the bank funded, the mall got built. If the mall got built, the developer had 200 smaller tenants to fill. Those smaller tenants, the ones selling shoes and jewelry and books and jeans, they didn't have the same standing. They weren't the reason the bank wrote the check. They were the product the bank was financing. And the leases they signed reflected that. Their rent wasn't just a fixed monthly payment. It was a fixed monthly payment plus something else. A clause required them to pay a percentage of their gross sales to the landlord once those sales crossed a specific line. There were 2 kinds of clauses written into most mall leases. One controlled what the anchor could block. This video is about the other one, the one that controlled what the landlord could take. The clause was called a percentage rent provision. Most people who worked retail in a mall have a version of this story. The base rent was what you paid every month no matter what happened. The percentage rent was what you paid when things went well. The better the store performed, the more it owed above the line. Take a store with $120,000 a year in base rent and a percentage rent clause set at 6%. The natural breakpoint, the threshold where the additional payment kicked in, was the base rent divided by the rate. $120,000 divided by 6% equals $2 million in annual gross sales. Every dollar the store sold above $2 million in that year sent 6 cents directly to the landlord, on top of the base rent already owed. Sears was at one end. Gap was 50 yards away. The rent those 2 stores paid was not the same thing. One is the Sears anchor at the end of the corridor, 200,000 square feet, the store your dad parked closest to on a Saturday morning. The other is Gap, 4,000 square feet, tucked into the inline space between the food court and the movie theater. Sears paid below market rent to be there. The developer needed Sears more than Sears needed any one mall. That was the negotiating reality in 1975, and everyone in the room understood it. Gap did not have that standing. Gap was one of dozens of inline tenants competing for the spaces the anchor made valuable. Gap signed what it was offered. What it signed included a percentage rent clause. When Gap had a good year, when the back-to-school season ran strong and the holiday rush converted, the clause activated. Everything above the breakpoint belonged, in part, to the landlord. The landlord had no corresponding obligation. The landlord did not hire additional staff during the holiday rush. The landlord did not carry inventory risk. The landlord did not pay suppliers when sales came in late. The landlord owned the floor Gap was standing on, and the lease gave it the right to take a share of whatever Gap earned standing on that floor. The natural breakpoint formula was designed to appear fair. The idea was that once a store was generating enough revenue to cover its rent costs comfortably, the excess would be shared. In practice, the formula captured something else. It captured the store's success. It taxed performance. A struggling store that never crossed its breakpoint paid only the base rent. A thriving store paid the base rent and then kept paying as it grew. The anchor that drew the customer paid below market. The inline tenant that converted the customer's visit into a purchase paid base, plus a cut of every dollar that made the mall worth visiting. That asymmetry was not accidental. It was the structural logic of the mall lease written out as arithmetic. Simon Property Group is one of the largest mall owners in the United States. Its tenants include many of the chain stores that made up the American Mall for 50 years. Simon's 2024 annual report describes part of its rental income as a component based on the revenues or total reported sales of the tenant. In plain terms, when a store does well, the landlord collects a share. In June of 2020, Simon filed suit against Gap Incorporated in Delaware Superior Court. Gap had closed stores across much of the country after state and local governments ordered non-essential retail to shut down. Gap withheld rent for April, May, and June. Simon's lawsuit claimed $65.9 million for those 3 months, across more than 400 Gap locations. Simon's complaint spelled out what the leases required. They required payment of both minimum annual rent and percentage rent, even in the event of a force majeure. Gap's stores had 0 sales. The government had ordered them closed. The percentage rent clause did not contain an exception for that. The Delaware courts also ruled on a related case in 2022, Simon Property Group versus Regal Entertainment Group. The court upheld the lease language requiring rent payment despite the pandemic restrictions. The clause held, the landlord collected. If you shopped at Gap in a mall, your store was one of the 420 locations that Simon took to court for a percentage rent it calculated was owed on sales the store was legally prevented from making. The lawsuit was publicly filed in Delaware Superior Court. The lease structure it describes is the same one that ran in your mall, in your city, in every inline store between the anchor at one end and the anchor at the other. Subscribe if you want to understand how the buildings around you were actually built. The clause guaranteed something that nobody talked about plainly at the time. The landlord profited most from the tenants that were doing the most work. A store that was struggling, one that had a bad season or lost a key manager or got outcompeted by a new store 2 doors down, paid its base rent and nothing more. Its problems were its own. The percentage rent clause was not activated. The landlord collected only the minimum. A store that was thriving, one that had found its customer, built its repeat traffic, and was turning over inventory at a rate the mall depended on, paid base rent, and then kept paying as its revenue crossed the threshold. Every dollar of growth above the line sent money to the landlord. The more successful the store, the larger the share the landlord received. The anchor had negotiated itself into below-market terms in exchange for providing the foot traffic that made every inline lease valuable, so it paid the least. It drew the customers. It justified the financing. It was the reason anyone drove to the mall at all, and it paid below market. The inline tenant, which depended on that anchor traffic to exist, paid base rent plus a cut of every successful sale. Gap did not draw people to the mall. Sears drew people to the mall. Gap captured some of them on the way through. The lease charged Gap for that capture, while the store that created the traffic paid almost nothing. This is not a hidden pattern. Commercial real estate professionals have described percentage rent clauses in educational materials for decades. The asymmetry was understood. The landlord had every incentive to attract the strongest possible inline tenants, sign them to percentage rent leases, and then benefit from their performance without sharing their cost structure. The anchor made the property valuable. The percentage rent clause made the inline tenant's success liquid for the landlord. The stores that kept your mall alive were the same stores the lease structure was designed to extract from. You paid the clause, not directly and not on a receipt, but every time you bought a pair of jeans at Gap or a ring at Kay Jewelers or a pair of shoes at Foot Locker, the store had already priced in what it owed the landlord at the end of the year. Retailers don't absorb operating costs out of margin when those costs are predictable and recurring. A percentage rent clause is both. Once a store crossed its breakpoint, typically in the back half of a strong year, the clause became a line item. It was accounted for in the same way the store accounted for payroll and inventory. The price of a pair of jeans at Gap reflected the store's cost structure, and that cost structure included a percentage of gross sales payable to Simon Property Group. You didn't see it on the receipt. There was no fee line for landlord percentage rent. But it was there, embedded in the margin the store needed to cover its obligations. The clause ran invisibly from the day the lease was signed until the day the store closed. The standard explanation for why your mall died is that Amazon came along and took the sales. That explanation is incomplete. Amazon was founded in 1994. The percentage rent clauses in American mall leases were standard before Amazon existed. They were written into leases signed in the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s by stores that had never heard of e-commerce, in malls that were full every weekend. Online shopping sped up the drop in foot traffic, but it didn't create the rent structure that was already running in the lease. What it did was cut into the store sales that had been covering the percentage clause each year. When a store that used to clear its breakpoint comfortably started struggling to reach it, the base rent still ran. The rent didn't go away just because customers had started buying online instead of walking in. The clause didn't kill stores in good years. It killed stores in bad ones because the good years had already been collected. The cruelest arithmetic in the mall lease ran from November through January. The holiday season was when most inline retailers made the money that justified the rest of the year. A store that had been paying its base rent through lean months in February and March and carrying inventory through a slow September was depending on Christmas to close the gap. Christmas was also when the percentage rent clause was most likely to activate. A store that barely crossed its breakpoint in a strong year crossed it in the fourth quarter. Every transaction ringing at Gap between Thanksgiving and Christmas Eve was a transaction that, above the threshold, sent a percentage to the landlord. The registers running hardest were the ones feeding the clause. Think about what that arithmetic meant for a store that was on the edge. It wasn't thriving. It had been covering its base rent and watching its margins compress as foot traffic softened and online sales pulled customers away. October was difficult. November picked up. December was the month the store actually made money. December was also the month the lease extracted the most. The stores that were barely surviving were the ones for whom the holiday season was a lifeline, and the holiday season was when the clause hit hardest. This was not a design flaw. The percentage rent clause was doing exactly what it was written to do. It captured the upside. The landlord's share of a good December did not depend on the landlord having done anything different in December. The landlord owned the floor, the lease gave it the clause, and the clause ran whether the store was thriving or hanging on. When a mall began to decline, the stores that stayed the longest were often the ones with the strongest customer loyalty. They had regulars. They had repeat traffic. They crossed their breakpoints most consistently. They were also the stores paying the most above base rent. The clause that ran in their leases was the same one that had been running when the parking lot was full. Simon Property Group went public in 1993 as a real estate investment trust. It owns real estate and has to pay out at least 90% of its taxable income to shareholders each year. That means the rent Simon collects from its stores gets paid out to shareholders as dividends. The percentage rent clause in that structure had a specific function. It meant that when GAAP had a strong year, Simon's shareholders had a stronger quarter. The clause converted retail performance into income for the real estate trust. The store's strong sales showed up as income for the landlord's investors before the store could put that money back into the business. In June of 2020, GAAP had no sales. The government had ordered every store in America closed. GAAP stopped paying rent. Simon filed suit for $65.9 million. The lease, according to the complaint, required continued payment of minimum annual rent and percentage rent, regardless of what had happened outside. The courts, when they ruled on similar cases, upheld the lease language. The clause held. That case did not end with a published verdict. GAAP and Simon reached a negotiated resolution, as most commercial landlord-tenant disputes do. The terms were not made public. What was made public was the complaint. The complaint describes in plain legal language what the clause required and what Simon believed it was owed. The stores that built the mall's value over 30 years, the ones that trained the customer to come to this specific building on this specific weekend, funded the trust's quarterly distributions. The stores that paid the most above their base rent were the ones performing well enough to cross the breakpoint. They were also the ones most at risk when foot traffic declined because they had the least margin available to absorb the loss. If you watched a Gap or a Kay Jewelers or a Foot Locker close in a mall you grew up in, and you assumed it was because nobody wanted to shop there anymore, subscribe. What we do here is find the clause behind the closure. Gap case in Delaware wasn't the end of percentage rent as a lease structure. It was a demonstration of what the structure had always been. The stores you watched close in malls that still had parking lots full on weekends didn't all close because the customers stopped coming. Some of them closed because the lease was structured to capture the years when the customers were still there. A strong decade of percentage rent payments left a store with less capital to weather the decade when the traffic softened. The extraction ran in the good years. The consequences ran in the bad ones. The American Mall was described, at the time of its collapse, as a victim of technology. Online shopping took the sales. Amazon built the logistics. The customers left. All of that happened. What it doesn't explain is why the buildings were filled with stores that had been paying a percentage of their best years to a landlord who owned the floor and nothing else. The anchor department stores had the negotiating power to walk away from that structure. They did. They paid below market. The inline tenants didn't have that power. They signed the leases they were offered. The clause ran for as long as the lease ran, and the leases ran for 10, 15, 20 years at a stretch. A mall that opened in 1975 with a 15-year lease cycle could be running third-generation percentage rent provisions in 2005. The parties to those original agreements were long gone. The obligation ran with the lease. The clause was still in the building. If you grew up going to a mall, If you drove there on Friday nights. If you watched your favorite stores close one by one while the parking lot was still half full. This is what was running in the lease the whole time. The rent that went to the landlord in the good years wasn't available to the store in the bad ones. The 400 Woolworth stores that closed in 1997 didn't close because retail changed. The deal that killed them is already in production.